Good morning, everyone. My name is Trish Zecca, and I'm a Senior Nutrition Program Manager here at IFNS, the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Science. Today's webinar, Why is Reducing Sodium So Hard? Sensory Science, Consumer Insights, and Culinary Solutions. This is the last in our sodium webinar series, which is part of a broad IFNS effort to promote understanding about what's new about the many roles of sodium. And this work was supported by the IFNS Sodium in Foods and Health Implications Committee. If you're interested in viewing the recordings of any of the other webinars in the series that you may have missed, you can visit our website at ifns.org and visit our continuing education page or the sodium webinar series page. For those, before we get started, I'd like to cover how to ask questions. This is the first format you may see on your screen. First, starting at the top, you'll notice an orange arrow. This arrow allows you to expand or collapse the control window on your screen. When this window is expanded, you can type in your comments and questions. And in fact, that's how we encourage you to interact with us. Questions that you type in are only visible to the IFNS staff and not other attendees. Some of you may have this meeting interface. It works the same way. You can enter questions at the questions box, and we will address all questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A. As a reminder, IFNS is a continuing education provider with the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and this webinar awards 1.5 CPEUs in accordance with the Commission on Dietetic Registration. All attendees will receive a link to the CPEUs certificate at the end following the webinar. So now I'll turn things over to our moderator of today's webinar. Marlene Schmidt is a Senior Nutrition Health and Wellness Manager at Nestle US, where she is responsible for establishing and integrating a nutrition, health, and wellness strategy across the Nestle food and beverage portfolio. She's a registered dietitian with extensive experience in assessing the latest science, regulatory, and marketplace trends to help companies drive innovation, brand positioning, and category-leading developments in the nutrition, health, and wellness space. Marlene will be introducing our speakers today, and then I'll join during the Q&A at the end. Welcome, Marlene.
Great. Thank you all for joining. This is our last and final webinar, as Trish mentioned, but I think this is a really personal one. This is about you. This is about me. This is about our fellow Americans. So we're going to start off today with our first speaker is Dr. Gary Beauchamp. Gary is a distinguished member and director and president emeritus of the Monell Chemical Senses Center. He was the director and president from 1990 to 2014. Dr. Beauchamp has served as a scientific advisor to numerous government and private organizations. He has published over 325 research papers and book chapters and has edited several books on the senses of taste and smell. His current research interests include the role of taste and flavor in food and beverage perception and acceptance, the genetics of chemosensation, olfactory communication in humans and other animals, and the development and aging of taste and smell. So Dr. Beauchamp, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to talk about one of my favorite white powders, which is salt. I present a brief presenter disclosure, which is there. And what I plan to do is talk first a little bit of introduction about human salt taste, taste qualities, and taste mechanisms. This will be a very high level, no details. Mention, of course, the necessity for reducing salt intake in the U.S. And then I want to just make about 6 different aspects of why it is that probably from a sensory point of view, it is so difficult to reduce the amount of salt consumed, certainly in the population and, of course, for the individual. So I start with the human taste qualities. And these qualities are found, go back thousands of years, and there's a strong agreement that there's 5 primary taste qualities: sweet, salty, umami, sour, and bitter, and that they're there through evolution to solve really important issues of consuming sufficient calories, sufficient protein, and avoiding bitter or toxic poisons. And so these are fundamental parts of our biology. And for example, sweet taste is built in, and we like it because that is what animals like to be able to detect calories. And salty exists presumably because sodium is so important to the body. We have to have a mechanism by which we can recognize it, because in the world of animals that eat plants or even are omnivores, there's a real necessity to be able to detect sodium because it's absolutely required for life. So obviously, the reason we're here is because of concern about excess intake. And I just put two little quotes up about from a recent Nature review on nephrology. And I want to emphasize the second one, where the authors note that globally, the average daily salt intake of 10 to 15 grams of sodium chloride far exceeds physiological requirements of the World Health Organization, where less than 5 grams of salt per day is recommended. I will try to use the grams of salt as the discussion, but there's times when we talk about sodium. But basically, I want to keep on all of us on the same page with talking about how much salt people consume and where it comes from. This is a figure that probably almost everybody has seen 1,000 times, which is the demonstration that in our culture, salt is in everything. Salt is everywhere. It's in all kinds of foods, many of which we don't even feel are salty. And as a consequence, if we are going to reduce salt in the population, one is going to have to reduce the amount of in all these foods. And in the US, as again, I'm sure all of you know, most of the salt consumed is consumed from manufactured food. That is food that's purchased in grocery stores or in restaurants or what have you. And the estimate is about 80% comes from that source. And so it's very, very difficult to reduce it. And in the olden days, when I was first studying salt, people kept talking about getting rid of the salt shaker, but that really won't help much in our culture for the average person. This is one of my favorite cartoons, which is, I guess, indicative of the view that excess salt is a danger to the individual and to the population. So let me just talk a little bit about how salt taste works. And again, I'm going to be very simple-minded here. So here's the human tongue. We have taste buds on the tongue. We also have taste buds way in the back in the palate. And interestingly enough, there's taste receptors and taste buds throughout the body, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the conscious perception of taste, which begins with the taste receptors on the tongue. So this is a cartoon of a taste bud. And what we believe now is that taste buds have taste cells, and in each bud, there may be a mixture of cells, some responsive to salt, some to sweet, some to sour, some to bitter, and some to umami. And then these detect the stimuli and pass this down to the brain, which I'm not going to talk anything about how the brain analyzes this, but this is the presumed mechanism by which we detect these basic tastes. I should say that these taste receptors can detect other compounds as well, but from the perceptual point of view, the major sensory response to taste is these 5 basic tastes. So there are 2 major types of taste receptors, which I've shown here. One, the GPCRs are, if you can kind of think of a lock and key mechanism, where the compounds, the molecules that elicit the taste are able to be detected by a receptor that's kind of like a lock and key, but this is a little bit different in that the variety of different kinds of keys could go into the lock. The one on the left, the ion channel, is very, very different. Here, the tastant, and we believe this is how salt works, the tastant does not go into a sort of a lock and key situation, but literally goes through a channel or a hole inside the cell. And this is very, very specific for salt. And as a consequence, as we'll see, there are very few compounds that actually are salty. This is another picture of this channel. It was finally published in 2009. This is clearly one of the major taste receptors, but it's not the only one. There are other, maybe less specific salt taste mechanisms which appear to exist. Amazingly, given what we know about so many other things, we're not sure exactly what these mechanisms are yet, even yet. There are several candidates, but and this is an area that we at Monell and many other places are working to try to understand what are all the mechanisms underlying salt taste. But the taste channel is probably the most important. So now I want to move to these 6 characteristics of taste that may compromise our ability to successfully reduce sodium in the population. First of all, it's widely believed, although it's difficult to prove, that there's an innate component to our liking for salt. And one reason that we believe that is because the many animal studies have shown that at the moment that an animal becomes salt deficient, it recognizes what it needs by taste, and it needs no experience to do that. So that's called salt appetite, and it's found in many plant-eating animals, and it's, however, very unusual in humans. It's in the general population, almost nobody is salt depleted. You may feel like you are, you may desire salt, but in terms of the body's physiology, humans are remarkably good at conserving salt. So salt taste, salt appetite in the sense of this tremendous desire to get salt is seen only in certain medical conditions. However, there is a salt preference, which is a bit different. And it's also true that many species like salt even when they're not depleted. Certainly humans do. And so most of our interest in salt consumption and trying to reduce it is about salt preferences and how these might be modified. So one reason we think that some tastes are innately responsive, responded to, is from facial expressions. And this is a newborn infant showing a positive, they claim it's a smile. I don't think it's that, but it's kind of a relaxation and a sucking desire for sweets. And this is a photograph. We've done studies on premature babies showing that they respond to sugar at the very first time that they've ever had anything prior to feeding. And this is a response to the opposite, the bitter taste. Clearly, this is a strong response, again, to an infant that has had no earlier experience. This is a response of an infant to salt, and as far as we can tell, this is unresponsive. This is the same way the infant would respond to plain water. And so there's no evidence that at birth, infants have a preference for salty substances. We've studied this in infants at different ages, and one of the interesting results of this is a demonstration of salt taste preference sort of developing at about 4 months of age. So on the left here is three substances that the babies are given to suck on. One is water, the other is a low concentration of salt, the second is a concentration 0.2 molar, which is about the level that would be found in commercial soups, for example. And as you can see, early on, there's no difference in response to these three substances. But by the age of 4 months, there's a clear preference for and a liking for salt. There are reasons to believe that, this change is due to a maturation of the salt taste receptor, and therefore reflects a kind of innate response that doesn't develop until about 4 months. But we do know also that dietary experience alters the liking for salt, and this is a kind of a difficult graph to explain, but basically what it shows is that children who are fed starchy table foods for the first months in life exhibit a high preference for salt. And if you would just look on the right side, at the age of 2 months, as we showed before, there's no particular preference for salt, but those infants that had been exposed to salty, starchy table foods show a very large preference. That's the red going up, whereas those that hadn't been exposed show, again, still show no preference. And I want to point out something here that we'll see in just a moment, which is the concentrations of salt. And down at the bottom on the far right of the graph, 0.34 molar salt is very, very salty. Again, it's about twice the level of typical soup, and yet these young children tend to have a strong preference for this. Here's another example of that. This is studies in 3 to 5 year old children. And on the left is their response to salt water, which of course we don't consume on almost any circumstance. And on the right is the same concentrations of salt in a clear soup. And these children by now respond just the way we would do. That is, that they reject the consumption, the percent preference for salty water, but they love salt when it's in a soup background. And again, notice that the concentration of 0.34 molar, which is very, very salty, is their preferred level, much, much higher than is commercially available. But we can look at adults and demonstrate that their response to salt is modified by experience. And this is obviously an anecdote, but it's a wonderful one, where Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels describes going to a country that has a very low salt diet. And when he gets to that country, he finds that he can't stand the food. It's bland. He doesn't like it. He almost can't get it down. But after a while, he gets used to it, and after a while, everything is fine. And then finally, he goes back to the country that he came from, and everything is way too salty. And so this is obviously just an anecdote, but there are a lot of other anecdotes suggesting that one can modify how much people like salt based on their experience with salt. And this is the first study we did many, many years ago that demonstrated this experimentally, proving what Gulliver knew 200 years earlier. So if you just look on the right side, the experimental side, we have two curves. One curve is testing people's response to how much they like salt in crackers, and the amount of salt is in grams on the bottom of those curves. And if one looks at the before they began a low salt diet, one sees that their optimal level of salt was quite high. It was actually the highest we gave them. But after 2 to 3 months, that moved down, and by 2 to 3 months, their preferred level of salt was much lower, and the high concentrations were not liked at all. And this is really the experimental demonstration of what Gulliver was talking about. And this has now been shown by a number of people. It's widely believed to be true. We got no one paper is going to prove anything, but if there's consensus, which there is for this, it seems to be a profound effect. And based on that, in part, CDC and FDA have recommended, and the Institute of Medicine formalized these recommendations to that what the U.S. diet should do is to the food industry should do is reduce sodium gradually in manufactured foods. And if this was done over time, and the time is not specified how much it would be, people would, the whole population could be brought down to be liking and consuming a lower level of salt. The attempts to do this, of course, other people will talk about. It's very difficult, but this is the theory that we should be able to reduce the amount of salt by gradually reducing it, and people wouldn't mind it because they would adapt to the lower levels. However, it's also the case, and this is kind of ignored, that you can go the other way. And so it's possible, there's a couple of studies that show this, to increase salt intake and therefore increase preference and move away from liking less salt. Now, I mentioned age-related differences in liking for salt, but I want to emphasize them again because this is a remarkable difference between children and adults. Here's a study, again, that we did many, many years ago, where we looked at adults and preschool children and measured their optimal level of salt in soup. The curve on the left, the red one, is adults, and lo and behold, the level at which we found the people liking salt was about what the commercial salt level was at the time. And on the right, you see again preschool children showing a remarkably strong preference for high salt. 40 years later, one of my colleagues did exactly the same study again, and this is on the right. You can see where I've circled it in black, and the results are identical. That the adults prefer about the same level of salt as found in commercial foods, whereas the children show a very strong preference for salt. So it's going to be important to think about how you feed younger children, because they seem, for reasons that we don't understand, to have a high preference for salt. It's been suggested maybe it has something to do with growing, that the sodium need is different. We don't know why it is, but it looks like it's very, very consistent across studies and across even across cultures. If we look at the other end of the age range, older adults may perceive salt as less intense than younger adults, and as a consequence may also tend to prefer higher salt levels. And this is one recent study that suggested that. This is a time intensity evaluation of salt. So they're looking at salt again over 10 seconds. If you just look at the right side, it's easiest to see that the ability to detect salt and the intensity of salt in older people never grows as strong as the ability of younger people. And it may be that they lose salt, their ability to taste it, and so consequently they may need more to reach the optimal levels for foods. And so I think one has to look particularly at the older people as maybe having a different salt world than the average middle-aged people. Probably, though, the most potent effect of salt in terms of its power to drive intake is its ability to modify other tastes and flavors. So I love this quote: "Salt is the general of foods," and anybody that looks at recipes knows just the potency of salt in virtually every recipe. This is again an old study by Marianne Gillette at McCormick, but it is, I think, the most beautiful salt study ever done. So what Marianne did was to study people's judgments of salted and unsalted soups. And the gray is the unsalted, the blue is the salted, and this spider plot I think everybody is probably familiar with. The distance between that red dot and the comparable blue or gray dots, it says how different they are. And basically, if you look at that red dot and go over to saltiness, you see obviously if you add salt, it makes it saltier. But notice that it tends to make it sweeter. It tends to increase thickness. It tends to increase fullness, flavor strength, balance, whatever that is, and reduces bitter and metallic. In other words, it makes a profound positive effect on it's not just saltiness, it's making it better. We studied this in a much more simple way, looking at salt's interaction with bitter, and there's good evidence to suggest that salt, and particularly the sodium part of salt, is able to modify the receptor such that it is inhibiting bitter taste. And we know for a variety of reasons, although we don't know the exact mechanism, that this is at the level of the bitter receptor. So if one looks at salt inhibiting bitterness, these are a group of bitter compounds. Some of them are inhibited more than others, and I'm going to talk about the one right in the middle there, urea, which is profoundly suppressed by salt. And again, this is the sodium part of salt, and it's at the receptor level. So what we demonstrated again a number of years ago is that by adding salt, therefore, to a mixture of bitter and sweet, one can actually make that mixture sweeter. And if you look at the left bar, that's the sweetness of sucrose. At the middle bar, the red one, that's the bitterness of urea. When those two are mixed together at the same molar concentrations they were in the first two bars, they suppress each other, and this part of suppression is probably going on in the brain. But if you add salt to it, what you do is you suppress the bitterness, that releases the sweetness from suppression and makes the whole thing sweeter. So this is, I think, just one kind of mechanism by which salt can modify foods in ways that are distinctive to particular foods and particular cuisines. Now, one obviously hope is that one could come up with a salt substitute that would be sodium free, presuming sodium is the thing we want to reduce. And I think that that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. If we look again at the receptor, and I remind you about how the receptors differ and how specific the salt receptor is. And this is illustrated in the next slide, which if we look and compare with sweeteners, these are compounds all sweet. Some are obviously bitter and sweet, some are off sweet, but many compounds are sweet, some natural, some not. But if you look at the primarily salty substances, very few things are sweet. And I think this is consistent with the idea that this salt taste receptor, the ENaC, the channel, is very specific to the sodium, the lithium ion. They're obviously similar. And KCl is an interesting point, which I don't have time to discuss, but we don't really understand why KCl is salty, but it's also, for many people, bitter or unpleasant. It's not bitter, it's bad. But so, in my judgment, we are never going to find an aspartame of salt. It just won't exist because of the mechanism of reception. However, that channel can be influenced by something that might enhance salt taste. And this is an example from some of my colleagues demonstrating that there is, at least in theory, the possibility of developing, and in practice now, enhancers for salt, so that the same level of salt can be made to taste saltier by adding something that itself is not salty. And that's what this shows, that L-arginine HCl added to low levels of salt increase the saltiness. But it only works at low levels, unfortunately. The last
Gary,
thing
I just want to give you a 2-minute time check.
the last thing I want to mention is something that's not a sensory thing, but I think is worth talking about, at least thinking about. And this is, if you remember, I said the average, I quoted somebody, the average amount of salt consumed is 8 to 12 or 15 grams a day. If one looks back at across cultures, one finds that this number comes up time and time again. And here's the oldest known estimate, and it's very, very rough, but it comes out 300 BC to 7.5 grams of salt per day. Here's some other estimates. Again, these are very, very rough, but again, are remarkable about the same levels of salt in these cultures that are independent and very, very old. Here's a nicer study, much more recent, but still old, looking at a variety of different cultures. And this is used to show that cultures where people consume very low sodium, they have very little hypertension. But my interest is on the far right, that most of the cultures that were looked at consume, again, about the same amount of salt. Now we think about this slide again, and that most of the salt comes from, in the US, a wide variety of foods. And the concern is, of course, that somehow we can't get away from it. But is there something else driving how much salt we consume? And these are some data I just recently took from a paper. Along the bottom level is the percent of discretionary salt consumed. That is the percent for these various countries all over the world, the percent of the salt consumed by an individual is added by the person at the table or cooking or whatever. In other words, it's not like in the US, it's not bought. Whereas in the US, we can see that the percent discretionary salt, and I've got it indicated there, is very low, whereas in India, it's very high. And on the vertical axis is the amount of salt consumed. And I can't attest that these are good estimates of salt intake per country. But what you can see is that the percent discretionary salt is actually consumes more salt than in the USA, where where the percent is very, very low. So it's hard to argue that the reason we're consuming so much salt is because of the way that salt is presented to us in all our foods. I'm going to skip this slide. So we don't know the basis for this relatively constant amount of salt consumed, but it's curious and I think worth looking at, because it may be that there's something about driving this level that we as yet physiologically don't understand. So my overall conclusions, leaving out that last very speculative issue, is that indeed population-wide reductions of salt will enhance health and save lives. In cultures like ours, obviously, the strategy has to be reducing it in the manufactured foods. But in cultures where they're still consuming as much salt as we consume or more, but it's being added at home or by the cook, very different strategies have to be used, and this has to be kept in mind. And I believe that the myriad mechanisms and functions of salt in food makes this population-wide reduction particularly challenging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Our next speaker is Carlos Nollendorf. He is the Market Insight Lead for Cargill Salt in Minneapolis. He has over 25 years of experience as an insights professional in the food industry. For Cargill Salt, Carlos is responsible for both primary research and analytics, Carlos conducts interviews and derives insights for all of the Cargill salt markets, the food market, the water quality, and the road safety market. In addition to Cargill and General Mills, he's worked at inside industry companies Nielsen, Kantar, and Numerator. So Carlos, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Hopefully you are all seeing my screen all right. I am very honored to be here and to be speaking to you today. I hope I bring a different perspective maybe than you've heard from a lot of my fellow presenters. We're going to talk a little bit more about consumers, and that sometimes it feels to me is kind of the forgotten piece when we start talking about sodium reduction. So as Marlene mentioned, I've been in the food industry for a long time now. I worked at General Mills for many years. Now I'm here at Cargill. And these conversations certainly have been going on for a long time in terms of sodium and sodium in the food supply. And certainly I've been exposed with my experiences to a lot of the conversations that take place between the FDA, between regulatory, and between food manufacturers. And certainly those are healthy and good dialogues to have. But what I would also argue is there's kind of a third leg to this stool, and it's consumers. Ultimately, they're the ones that are eating our food, and they're also the ones that should have a pretty loud voice in what's going on in terms of sodium in food and just food in general as well. So hopefully at the end of my presentation, you'll have a little bit more perspective in terms of what consumers face and how they think about reducing sodium. And I would argue that a lot of the work that we're doing on the technical side of things needs to be matched by things that we do on other sides of the coin as well. So the first thing I'm going to show you is what we call ingredient tracker. This is a quantitative survey, and this is something proprietary to Cargill. We've been doing it for 10 years now. I've got results through wave 9. So wave 10 is shortly going to be released, but hasn't been done yet. In 2020, in wave 9, we assessed 291 ingredients. You may wonder why so many. Cargill is very interested in understanding context, so really understanding not only the ingredients we sell, but also the ingredients that speak to the broader world. And we really want to understand consumer perceptions around it. And you can see we asked a lot of consumers, over 12,000 respondents completed an online survey. And the real purpose here is to identify ingredients that drive seeking and in many cases avoidance behaviors. So we'll talk a little bit to avoidance in particular in my presentation, but certainly you will see a number of ingredients highlighted here that also have that seeking behavior as well. The other important thing is because we do this annually, we're able to highlight changes over time. So you'll see a little bit about how the world has changed in consumers' minds just in a couple of places. And then finally, just to point out, for the most part, we're measuring their perceptions, not their behaviors. So just because a consumer says they are trying to avoid it or they are avoiding something does not mean that that necessarily translates into their actual purchasing behavior at the end. Okay, so our key measures in ingredient tracker, we cover familiarity. And it's important to point out that even though consumers may not be very familiar with an ingredient or with a particular compound, we still do ask them about the impact to their purchase, their health perceptions, and so on. It's important because those ingredients are going to show up on the package whether or not they are familiar with them, and so we want to understand what that impact will be. After that, we ask them about purchase impact. Is this ingredient more or less likely to make you purchase a product? So again, we're trying to understand their perceptions and really what the impact could potentially be to an ingredient. And then following that up with health perceptions, so really understanding how they feel about the healthiness of a particular ingredient when they look at it in a vacuum. We do ask some questions about avoidance as well on an unaided basis. And you'll see as we get towards the end of the survey results that I'm going to show you that we also do ask some more behavioral questions about diets that they're following and things of that sort as well. So let's dive in and talk a little bit about familiarity. So a few things to point out on this chart. We are looking just at salt and what I would call salt ingredients. The first thing that surprises me is that 3% of the population reports not to be familiar with salt. I think that's kind of unusual. Maybe it's just part of the remnants of the survey a little bit, but there are some people who say that they're not familiar. The second part is that we've got a number of salts here: sea salt, kosher salt, pink Himalayan salt. We speak to those as more premium salts, and you can see that at varying degrees, most people have some familiarity with them. And then finally, and most importantly for this audience, you can see at the bottom of the familiarity list here, potassium chloride and potassium salt. Those are both right around 50% of consumers saying that they have familiarity with those. Those are probably our two best solutions right now when it comes to sodium reduction or sodium replacement. And so it says to me that we probably have some work to do to really make sure that consumers are aware of those products and what they're for. The positive thing is that as we look over the course of all the waves where we've been tracking potassium salt, potassium chloride, it has improved in terms of familiarity. So we've come quite a long way from where it was about 5 years ago or so, but I would argue that we still have a long way to go. So the next question we ask is really around avoidance behavior and really understanding, does a particular ingredient make you more or less likely to buy a product if you see that on the ingredient label? And you can see, again, a few interesting pieces here. Those salts that I highlighted before, sea salt, pink Himalayan, and kosher, all have very positive perceptions behind them. So consumers see those and agree that those are good salts and things that they don't need to avoid as much. They're more likely to purchase a product with it. Salt kind of lands in the center. And I think that speaks a little bit to Dr. Beecham's comment that salt is everywhere. And consumers do understand that. So it's difficult for consumers to avoid salt, and they understand that. Potassium salt and potassium chloride are friends and are allies in terms of sodium reduction. I would say they still have a bit of a PR issue. So we're still seeing that consumers are a little bit less likely to purchase products that have those. I would say that a lot of that ties into the familiarity aspects that we've already spoken about. When we transfer over to understanding health perceptions, you can see actually potassium chloride and potassium salt are a little bit elevated. What's interesting is salt is a little bit demoted within that. So again, speaking to what I spoke about before, salt is everywhere and consumers understand that. So it doesn't necessarily impact their purchasing behavior, but they certainly understand that it's not a positive in terms of their health perceptions. All right, so let's talk a little bit about avoidance. And the first question we ask consumers in terms of avoidance, the only question really, is are there any ingredients that you're trying to avoid when you eat? So this is really looking at all the ingredients that were listed. This is an open-ended question, so consumers just report, and we're essentially counting percentages here. So you can see sugar and sucralose. I don't think that would be a surprise to anybody in the audience. Is the most avoided ingredient. Around 40% in the last wave had mentioned that, but not far behind is salt and sodium. So again, you can see salt is something that is top of mind in terms of consumer avoidance behavior, and it's around a quarter of the population that says that they're doing that. So we do ask a few additional questions, like I said, and really these additional questions sparked some interest in our minds to go out and really understand a little bit more about consumers' behaviors, what's working and what's not. So like I referred to, unaidedly, consumers said that they're trying to reduce their sodium. And when we ask them directly, are you following a diet that includes low sodium? About that same quarter of consumers say that they are. Okay, again, this is reported behavior, not necessarily true behavior. But one of the things that really gave us pause was when you look at how long they said they were on that diet in the last 12 months, the vast majority said, I've been following it for the entire 12 months, or at least more than half of that time. So it's a pretty pervasive diet that consumers report that they're following. It's also what I would call a very sticky diet. About 3 out of 4 are sticking to that diet and really following that diet as well as they can. All right, so with those numbers in mind, given that it was a pretty large part of the population and people are sticking to it, we went out and we really wanted to deep dive with consumers and understand what are their needs, what's working, what's not. Really what I'm going to speak to you today on is what are the barriers that they reported that say reducing sodium is difficult. So this research, like I said, is very deep research. So we didn't talk to 12,000 people in this particular research. We talked to 12, but it wasn't a short survey. It was a 2-hour in-home interview. So that really gave us the opportunity to see what's going on in the kitchen, what's going on in the pantry, what are the things that work on your telephone, what are the things that you're doing here and there. So very, very important to understand that while this is not necessarily that high quantification, this is very, very strong and deep research into understanding what makes those consumers tick. The audience that we spoke to, 6 of them were actively reducing sodium or following a reduced sodium diet. 3 of them were interested or intending, as we said, but had not started yet. So we really wanted to understand what were the things maybe that they were facing as they were thinking about starting that as well. And then we added a group of people who were also formerly on a reduced sodium diet, really to understand where are they now and maybe what were the barriers that caused them to stop. All right. So as I go through this next set of results, I urge you to kind of look at the colored boxes at the bottom of the screen. These are direct quotes from our interviews. And I'll talk you a little bit through the detail of each one. But again, from the mouths of consumers, these are some of the things that they were saying. So again, in mind and thinking about barriers, this first one I think is not a surprise to us. And if you think about Gulliver, like we said, there may be some solutions that kind of get us there. But not surprisingly, most consumers worry, especially when they're at the beginning of their journey, that they're going to miss foods and flavors that they've grown up with. It seems that those who do a good job of reducing their sodium are able to overcome those cravings. And again, if you think about Dr. Beecham's comment of Gulliver, a lot of consumers reported that yes, in a couple of months, I was actually able to overcome a lot of that salt, and even said, things taste saltier to me now, and it's not necessarily great. Some people also had what they called a cheat. So something when they were really having a craving that they could fall back on that maybe wasn't the best for them, but also helped them to get tided over whatever craving that they happened to be having. I think one quote that really stood out to me was one intender who said, the hardest part is going to be that I love chips. And so a lot of consumers, again, as they started thinking about the greatest barriers, said that taste was going to be a barrier. So certainly it's something that we need to face as a barrier and as a challenge to us. But now we're going to look at some other barriers that probably are a little bit less technical in your minds. So the next one was a lot of consumers didn't know what to do or even how to get started. In most cases, the consumers we spoke to had learned from a doctor that their blood pressure was too high or that there was another issue going on, and the recommendation had been to lower their sodium. But most of them also walked out of that conversation with the doctor not informed and not armed with how they were going to accomplish that. Some said that they got a pamphlet from their doctor, but in many cases, the doctor said, well, good luck, and let them out. So many consumers said the first thing that they would do is go home and fall back onto Google to educate themselves. But what that really led to was a lot of consumers thinking that they were responsible for creating their own system. And quite honestly, of the 12 people that we talked to, not all of them, of course, were dieting actively at the time, but most of them had a different system. Although some did say that they had apps on their phone that would help. This is one of my favorite quotes from this particular barrier. We did not get off to a good start on reducing sodium. We didn't know what to look for. And so again, as you think about it, how does the patient walk out of the doctor's office, and who are they able to refer to? The awareness and the education is a big barrier and a big opportunity for us at the same time. This, of course, we've heard before as well. I need convenience and affordable food. And I think most consumers understand that following this lifestyle is going to take a lot of time and effort. But for a lot of these consumers, life gets in the way. Planning and forethought is always needed. And they felt that it was very easy to fall off the rails if they were not planning ahead. Most of them said time and effort was one of the biggest things that got in the way when they were thinking about it. And a number of consumers did talk about the cost of food being a concern, although not all of them. And most of them felt like it was not that difficult to fall into a low sodium lifestyle given a little bit of time. It was more the time and effort that went into it. This quote really spoke a lot to me. I had to cut out go-to easy meals and start cooking from scratch. And the key word to me in that is easy. This consumer really saw that cooking from scratch was not easy. And he didn't feel like there were a lot of alternatives that he could use for easy meals that also provided low sodium for him. So let's talk about a couple of the more emotional issues as well, and a couple of the bigger barriers when you think about pressure from the outside or maybe society a little bit more. So a lot of consumers reported anxiety with eating out. It really brings their needs and it brings their sodium reduction into a more social light. A lot of people felt a lot of anxiety by doing that, especially because most of them were being invited to eat out with friends, with whoever it happened to be. For those who are trying to reduce sodium, it again requires some sort of pre-planning. We had consumers say that I have to research the menu before I go, so I'm confident that I can find something that I want. And for a lot of the people, if they couldn't find anything, they needed to plan how they were going to explain that they were not going to eat. For some, easiest solution was just complete avoidance. We spoke to a number of people who said, I just don't eat out anymore. And for some, giving in was really the solution. So my local restaurant has a killer pizza. I just sometimes need to allow myself the pleasure. So again, you can see this is an emotional issue for a lot of these consumers, and eating out in particular, because it brings it into a more social realm, created a lot of anxiety and a lot of concern. On top of that, so not even eating out, but eating in. Many didn't want to, many in their households felt like they were the only one in their household that wanted to change. So in many cases, we were finding that people who were following low sodium diets were creating different plates than everybody else in the household. Those who succeeded in their minds were able to spend time shopping for multiple tastes, multiple needs, multiple consumers. And again, you can kind of see how this ties back into the time and effort that was needed. Interestingly enough, I think many people who said my household is being supportive, they were not being supportive in terms of sharing the food. Most consumers that we spoke to said that my food choices are different, and we've just decided that that's the easiest way to deal with my needs versus everybody else's needs. So again, if you think a little bit broader about this, it's creating isolation even within a family setting. Everyone in our house has a different need or taste. I feel like a short order chef. One of the consumers was cooking 3 separate meals every single day. One for himself on a low sodium diet, one for his spouse who was on a different diet altogether, and then one for his kids who didn't like the food that the adults were eating. Finally, just one more barrier here that I wanted to highlight a little bit. Consumers were asking for simpler labels. They wanted better understanding. Most consumers, when they were looking at the label, and most reported looking at labels and reading labels, most of them looked immediately at the percent daily value. That was their shortcut for understanding, is this a good choice for me? Is this not necessarily the best choice for me? And they would do it based on that percentage. They would say, is that 10% of my day? Is that 15% of my day, etc. However, as labeling has evolved over time, variation in serving sizes, dual columns on nutrition facts panels, all of this additional information that we're providing is adding layers of complexity. They have to do more calculations. Interesting quote about this, the serving size for this cereal is 1 cup, but that's not what I'm going to eat. So another calculation. And then finally, many examples where what was reported or what was claimed on the front of the pack was not necessarily consistent with what they were hoping to accomplish for their sodium needs. So again, a very powerful quote here. Low sodium relative to what? So a lot of consumers really had a hard time understanding how something can be lower sodium, and it should say lower sodium in that quote, but lower sodium and still have a very high sodium level in their minds. All right, so just to wrap up really quickly, carried you through a lot of the consumer perceptions, a lot of consumer thoughts. First thing, as we kind of learned from the ingredient tracker, is that the solutions that we have that are available to us now are not very familiar to most consumers. I've kind of said it's a little bit of a PR issue for potassium salt, potassium chloride in particular. It is improving with time, but I think if we were willing to support it a little bit more and tell consumers that this is a positive to look at and to look for, we could really accelerate that as well. Second, around 1/4 of consumers say that they're actively trying to reduce sodium. To me, that's a very large opportunity. 1/4 of the population is reporting that. That's a lot of people. It's very addressable. And I think companies and manufacturers who develop products that are meeting expectations and also do a good job of marketing effectively to others and targeting those groups are going to be the ones that succeed against that very large and addressable population. And then finally, hopefully, from the research that I showed you, consumers who are doing it now are still running into barriers. The taste trade-off, what we've been talking a lot about this week, is really the tip of the iceberg for a lot of consumers. And again, quoting our old friend Gulliver, it's probably something that with time can be overcome. But the question is, how do we remove those other barriers? How do we limit the guesswork? How do we make it easier for consumers to follow this lifestyle? Many of them felt like the cards were stacked against them. So real quick in conclusion, sodium reduction, in my mind, and hopefully you share this view after hearing some of what I've spoken about, it's not just a technical or a product issue. It also has to do with awareness, with social pressures. Peer pressure is still there even when you get older. Perceptions, emotions, there's a lot really kind of in there. But the consumers that we've spoken to, and again, this large addressable market says they want solutions. So I challenge us to think a little bit more about that third leg of the stool. What is it that consumers are looking for? And how can we remove barriers and make their lives easier? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Great. So our third and final speaker is Chef Robert Fedorko. He is the Director of Culinary Innovations at Nestle. He is an accomplished food and beverage executive with extensive experience in all aspects of CPG brand development and restaurant operations, including upscale hotels and resorts. At Nestle, he leads the development and implementation of innovative products and platform ideas, by also contributing to the strategic growth of Nestle's mega, intermediate, and startup brands. Prior to joining Nestle, he spent 19 years at Marcus Hotels and later at Sonesta Resorts, where he held executive positions in food and beverage. So welcome, Robert.
Thank you very much, Marlene. So I find myself a savory person. In the restaurant world, we really try to think of the consumer in trying to entice them to eat your food as a savory or a sweet individual. And I think if I asked you that question, you might say, hey, I definitely want to make sure that I have a dessert after dinner. And when I think about that, me as a savory person, I would say, would you like a piece of cheesecake or would you like another baked potato with butter? That's me. I'm a baked potato and butter person. So I think about salt on a regular basis. And as I started my education in understanding salt many, many years ago, I found that some of the slides we'll go through really are indicative of what the general consumer is interested in when it comes to food. I lead a culinary team that is considered to be a gold standard culinary team for Nestle, and we develop food and beverage products for the various brands of Nestle that are really focused on the out-of-home consumer and understanding what would be the preference in an out-of-home environment. And then we work with our research and development team and our technical application team to take those ideas and recipes and industrialize them for the consumer. So in culinary innovation, not only do I consider myself that savory person and understanding what that really means to the world, my world, I really want to focus on understanding what are the key metrics that help me to understand the consumer and what drives their decision making when it comes to food and beverage. So from a chef's perspective, salt is an essential ingredient, just as has been just identified in the previous two presentations. Salt is critical, and it's a low-cost ingredient. It really enhances just about every ingredient that it comes in contact with, barring some of the bitter that we've discussed just a few seconds ago. But it is a flavor enhancer. It's a seasoning balancer. It's also an ingredient that creates depth and complexity and certain textures in food that are very important for making things enjoyable. Control and precision is done by the chef in their hand when they're preparing the food. And this is something that both the previous presenters, Gary and Carlos, represented in their presentations. Is a lot of the additional sodium is added by the consumer in their home or in the restaurant environment. And one thing that we try to do at Nestle is really try to balance that thought process of not having the consumer add additional salt to their food or a sodium product. So we want to put out a product that is well balanced and delivers the right level of flavor and taste and texture of the consumer. Ingredient enhancement, salt is used to enhance all the natural flavors and specific ingredients, and whether it's driving that through the original product, say a meat or a poultry product, by marination or some other form of flavor enhancement, to just the final product having an additional salt added to the ingredient list to make it more enjoyable for the consumer. Salt is, and these slides, I love this. We did not talk about this before we were seeing these presentations, but we're all driving on the same sensory and taste and the 5 basic tastes. All 3 of the presenters here today, I think, it's just an important aspect of how you look at food in general. But sweet being very pleasing and sour, driving acidic flavors. Think about a tomato sauce, and you can have the argument of, when I make my tomato sauce, I'm going to leave it as is, just flavor it with basil and garlic and maybe some onion and some salt and pepper, or I'm going to add sugar to that sauce and make it a little bit more sweet and a little bit more palatable. There's sometimes when you do that, sometimes when you don't. I don't do that. In particular, I want to make sure that I'm driving the flavors that I'm most interested in without adding another ingredient that is on consumers' list, whether it be salt or sugar. Bitter is a very interesting element for us. When we do training in our culinary center, or we do some tastings and we organize panels, what we look for is understanding how people perceive bitter, so that we'll understand how they perceive the salt or saltiness of the dish. And that includes also the sour and sweetness of the dish as well. But we want to understand how they understand bitter. And bitter is an inherited attribute to someone's taste pattern. So you may find that you have the same taste as your mother or your father, or maybe both. But in typically you're going to have a connection to one or the other over the other, if that makes sense. I know it's a large way around it. My daughter and I taste food exactly the same, and my wife and my daughter and I do not taste food the same. We are very sensitive to bitter, and she's not. So that makes cooking in our own home a little bit different, and trying to understand how that influences the food that we eat. But salt is an incredibly important part of that, and reducing salt to reduce bitterness or enhance bitterness is something that we really work on. One of the opportunities that chefs have in general is umami, and that's really looking at the opportunity to drive flavor and rich, meaty flavors through enhancement of the process, so that we can reduce some of the other things like salt that we want to drive lower. So the four things that a chef would look at when they're creating food is salt, fat, acid, and heat. And salt being the number one driver for balance as far as flavor enhancement. And fat is flavor and texture enhancing, and acid is a flavor driver. So once you have the balance of the fat and the salt, you use an acid to maybe enhance that slightly so that you can reduce one over the other. And then you might drive something through heat, and meaning you're going to add something like a pepper or a chili or something that's going to give you just a little bit more texture when it comes to the developing of the flavor palette. And this is critical in for chefs to learn this balance, because if you can get balance, and I think that Carlos mentioned it in his presentation, if you can achieve balance, then you can make sure that you're not over-delivering or have to over-deliver on one specific attribute. And typically that falls back on salt. And if you don't get the right balance, you say a little more salt will bring that edge to make something taste better. And that's really, really what a chef should try to avoid. The universal flavor enhancer is sodium by far. It is the easiest way to deliver on enhanced flavor. It's not always the best way from a chef perspective. It could mask a lot of things that are missing in the dish or in the food that you really want to improve upon. And it can amplify the ingredients, but it can also take away from some of those flavors. If you think of something similar to maybe an Asian dish that has just a little bit too much soy or a little bit too much salty flavor in there and not enough sweet to balance it, you have to really consider those ingredients. I apologize if my mouse is freaking out on me here. Salt does not impart interfering or undesirable flavors. Salt, initial taste, is initial taste as well as an aftertaste. Sodium makes food smell better, and aroma is a large portion of how we taste food to begin with, whether it's aroma in terms of the essence that's coming out of the oven, or once the food is coming out of the pan, or once it's on the plate. That aroma that you experience could make up to 70 or 80 or even 90% of the experience overall. And by far, sodium helps to contribute to that. So some drivers for chefs to consider are flavor drivers. And how can we reduce salt and sodium and drive flavor? And this separates into 4 categories. The top notes, the middle notes, the finish notes, and the depth that you create by technique. And ways of achieving this are through adding spices, adding herbs, adding acid, adding heat, and then your technique. And driving umami through technique is really how you develop the depth of the food. Think of steak that maybe, you know, baked in the oven that doesn't really drive a lot of flavor, or if you grill that steak or chicken or fish, or if you sauteed in a pan and create a Maillard effect and bring really top notes and depth to that flavor, you can reduce things like salt, and you can just add spices, herbs, and acid to really drive those flavors. So looking at some of the ways of driving some of these flavors with salt, it's been presented in both the prior presentations, but sea salt and pink Himalayan salt, great additive, trace minerals, naturally resourced, something that chefs don't use a lot. They typically will use it if they want to try and drive a visual effect on the food. Kosher salt is where most chefs play, and it's a naturally sourced product. It's chef preferred. It's coarse, large crystals. There's no iodine added, and it's really the purest of the salts that the chefs use. And it's typically good because they can feel it or pinch it and understand how much they're adding to the food product. And that's where chefs will typically look to the salt that they'll typically look to use. Table salt obviously is mined and dehydrated with trace minerals and fortified with iodine, which is what you're getting on the table any day you put it out of the shaker. Always a great thing in support of thyroid health and other things. But chefs typically don't use iodized salt in their cooking because sometimes it could impart a slightly off-putting taste. Potassium salts and potassium chlorides and sodium, potassium salts and chlorides, substitutes for salt. Sometimes when you're cooking, they can add a little bit of an off taste. So you have to be very careful with how much you use, and you couldn't use it in full, in a chef's perspective, you wouldn't use it in a restaurant in full swap out to a kosher salt or another salt. And then sodium delivering essential minerals is critical to the food that you're preparing. Looking at a case study that we just completed at Nestle just not too long ago. This has led to products that, I wanted to share with you today. There are new heart healthy meals, and it's through the Lean Cuisine line. It's called Heart Check Certified Meals, and they're working in conjunction with the American Heart Association to lead with flavor without sacrificing taste or convenience. And our chefs across Nestle, this was a huge project for us, a huge undertaking. This is something that's never been achieved before, and working with this organization was really rewarding for the teams, and it helped us to learn that we're not as far off as we think we are, and we just need to focus a little bit harder to make sure that we're hitting these metrics that are important. And our chefs work side by side with nutritionists to create frozen meals, deliver these bold flavors. The new heart healthy meals come in 4 varieties, and with nutritious varieties that contain 400 calories or less, 1 gram or less of saturated fat, 20 milligrams or less of cholesterol, and then each meal has 10 grams of protein, which is with bold and vibrant flavors, so that our consumers not missing out on something. And I think you may have seen in the previous presentation from Cargill, their consumers were afraid of missing out, and we want to make sure that they're not missing anything when they try this food, and that's a critical piece for us. So even having some great opportunity or options for flavors: apple cranberry chicken, butternut squash ravioli, herb roasted chicken, garlic sesame noodles. We've really looked at those 4 varieties and how can we deliver a taste and a flavor that delivers on what the consumer is looking for. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to offer any more insights that you might need, but a chef's perspective on food is slightly different, but I will tell you that listening to what Gary had to say and what Carlos had to say, we are really talking about the same consumer and the same product and the same metrics when it comes to the consumer enjoying food. And I just really wanted to close with that, as you say, how to reduce sodium, and really why is reducing sodium so hard? It's so hard because it makes food taste so much better. Whether it's sweet or it's savory or it's even in some beverages, it just makes things better. And whether that's good or bad, the balance of that sodium as it's in your diet is really what's critical. And understanding that balance and that education piece is really where we need to focus. Thank you for having me here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. Trisha, I'll turn it over to you to take us through the Q&As.
Absolutely. Fabulous presentations. I'll also invite Gary to join us again, and unmute yourself and turn on your camera. There we go. All right, so as we just finished with culinary, one of the questions that we have is for you, Robert. So how are these things being addressed in culinary school? Are chefs being encouraged to utilize other techniques than salt to deliver taste? Are they educated on nutrition or to limit ingredients that deliver nutrients of public health concern? What's happening in school?
Yeah, not as much as you think. They're learning to balance in their in the way that they prepare food. Once they finish school, getting a degree in some kind of food science, or maybe it is culinary school, they come to us. We have a training program that we put our technical application people through to understand it even more. So not only do we teach the classics, but we also go back and we teach them, now that you have the classics, reduce, how can we bring down salt, fat, and sugar, and the things that influence the food that we want to make sure that we're managing for our consumers.
That's wonderful that the individual organizations like Nestle are addressing that with the chefs and the product developers that come into the companies. But how can we change education in culinary schools?
Well, I think that some of it goes back to, I'm not, as I think about it, I'm not certain that the basics of culinary school need to be changed, because you need to teach the basics. And if you follow the basics of cooking and the basics of technique, you will hit the metrics you're looking for. When we create products in our culinary center, and we create them from a gold standard perspective, typically on the first or second go around, we hit all the metrics that hit the dietary requirements for the consumer. And that's what we're looking for. And that comes out of our culinary education. I also believe, Trish, that there's an opportunity to say, what's the next generation look like? Where is the consumer going from a global perspective? And how can we can teach that in different ways? I think you see across the globe, there's a couple of new schools popping up around the globe, which are phenomenal, that are teaching these skills, and we need to bring them to the U.S. for sure.
That's great. We have another question, this for Gary, if you are still with us, Gary. There was a question related to, is salty taste unique to sodium chloride, and what about non-chloride sodium salts?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, it's very interesting. If you have, say, a sodium gluconate or a sodium acetate, the same sodium concentration is much, much less salty. And so when I mentioned that we add salt to this mixture, we add sodium gluconate. So we're not adding a saltiness, we're adding the sodium. So it's the sodium that's driving this, but the larger the associated part of the molecule, the less salty it is.
And what happens when we think about the other parts of our digestion? So is salty taste only driven by salt receptors in the mouth, or are there receptors in the gut or liver that can also affect preference?
I'm sure there are effectiveness of preferences throughout the whole body. I mean, because sodium is so important. So we know these kinds of receptors exist, again, in many parts of the body, and particularly even in the brain. So yes, they can drive it, but they're not part of the actual perception of our taste response. The perceptual part is primarily through the oral cavity.
Thank you. And then this question, really, I'll invite any of the presenters to weigh in on this, but what about the food industry and even beyond manufactured food, restaurant services? What is their responsibility here to offer reduced sodium choices? And and then balanced with the need for consumers to actually select those choices?
That's a very loaded question, of course. Responsibility is a different area that I'm involved in, but I was on the Institute of Medicine committee that made the recommendation that, and our recommendation on that committee 15 years ago was that the FDA should require industry to gradually reduce the level of salt in manufactured food and in restaurant food, for that matter. Of course, that never happened, but there certainly is the recommendation that they should. And my experience is that many people in industry are doing yeoman's work trying to do that. But I think from my perspective, and I think maybe for all three of us, that is obviously a difficult thing because salt plays so many different roles and so profoundly powerful roles in food that it's just not a simple thing. And certainly there's not one solution. It depends upon the food medium you're talking about.
Robert?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Gary said there. It's a very loaded and difficult question to answer. I will say that it's part of everything we do every day, and when we're developing, whether it's the gold standard of that product or the industrialization, it is top of mind conversation with everything. And I think when it comes to the restaurant world, it's a chef wants to put out food that tastes great and brings the consumer back. They're going to do everything they can to bring that consumer back, and understandably, sometimes it may have the sodium level may not be right. It's when you have a restaurant that has unseasoned food where the consumer's adding the salt or adding the product, the flavor enhancer themselves, where you could run into a little bit more of a problem. So it's a difficult balance. In all of my restaurants, I always did not put salt and pepper on the table. It came out balanced, and if the consumer wanted something different, then we added, then we'd send it to them. But balance is the key, and it's really hard to think about how you would engage everyone in the same conversation.
Carlos, I do have a couple other questions. I can keep going, but if you have audio, let us know. All right, then as a follow-up to that question, Robert, I have noticed at some restaurants that it's becoming more of the norm not to see salt and pepper on the table. Is that a trend that you're seeing, and is that related to the answer you just provided?
Yeah, it's most definitely a trend, and I think that as the industry has more chefs who come through a professional training program, understand how to deliver flavors better or differently, that's where you get the advantage of having the consumer taking the power of the sodium and salt out of the consumer's hand and making sure that the chef is balancing that. I think that sometimes restaurants get a bad rap in terms of how much salt they have in their food, and sometimes it is overbalanced. There's no doubt about it, but many times it's more balanced than we might think. As well as some frozen foods as well. Sometimes they are over-indexing, but sometimes they're more balanced than we think they are.
And then the last question that we have time for today, and this might want to be one of those loaded questions, Gary, is what is the missing piece here? If any of you were able to dial into our previous webinar on potassium, what we heard that research shows that if individuals consume sufficient potassium, it immediately has a blood pressure lowering effect, regardless of the amount of sodium consumed. So we're not suggesting that people should eat as much salt and sodium as they want, but we definitely have a crisis here in our diet where we do not consume enough potassium-rich foods. So what are your thoughts related to sodium and potassium balance? Again,
As you said, that's a loaded question. There's disagreement there. Again, when in the Institute of Medicine committee discussed this issue, and this is 15 years ago, there was concern that if one pushed too hard on using potassium as a substitute, there were particular populations of people with heart disease that this could cause a problem. And so the committee did not recommend strongly the use of potassium salt as a substitute. To me, the thing that's really, really scientifically interesting is if we could understand why potassium chloride tastes salty, there may be some pathway there that we could use that as a salt substitute without the some of the negative consequences for some people of potassium chloride. So I think there's an opportunity there to look at that particular mechanism and maybe find a way to find a substitution. Nevertheless, as I suggest, I think that the power of sodium chloride as a taste enhancer in the broad meaning of the word enhance is so great that, and potassium chloride doesn't do many of the things that sodium chloride does. So I think it's going to be difficult, but it's it's the best we have right now, and so further work on it is certainly merited.
Chef Robert, did you have anything to add to that related to potassium in the diet or in food?
No, I agree with everything that Gary had said there. It can have some adverse effects that on health or on other health issues that have to be taken into consideration for sure. And it's better to say that from a potassium perspective that you're going to look at your fruits and vegetables and legumes and other products to get your potassium rather than adding it as a supplement into a product to drive flavor. That's just purely my opinion on that.
And Carlos, do we have audio down?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Great. So
excellent.
If you remember the question, it was twofold. It was, do you have any insights on whether consumer purchases actually reflect the perspectives in your survey, or any understanding related to whether consumers have and are able to distinguish between low, reduced, or no sodium products?
So I think, and this is leaning maybe a little bit harder into the qualitative research, certainly those people, when we looked in their pantries, we could see a lot of products that claimed lower sodium. We could also see that they understood the communication in most aspects when it came to what was a higher sodium food and what was a lower sodium food. Whether it translates directly, I think that goes back to Dr. Beecham's comment that salt is everywhere, and so it's often a difficult thing to avoid. Many people spoke to trying to buy what they called more whole foods, so things that were fresh. But again, that raises a lot of issues. So I think from a qualitative perspective, certainly when we go in and observe and talk to people who are reducing their sodium, they do have a lot of tools in their quiver to be able to do it. But like I said, they also cite a lot of barriers and a lot of time and effort that has to go into making sure that the choices in the store and even in the home sometimes.
Well, thank you very much. All the presentations were fantastic and given us a lot to think about in terms of the complexity of affecting sodium in the diet and its relationship to public health, blood pressure. And so I want to thank all of our presenters for today. We will try to address all the questions that were submitted. And if you have any others, you can reach out to me directly at tzek@ifins.org. Again, thank you to all the presenters and everyone for hanging in with us, and have a great day.